We're live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another and the final NSP responding to Jordan Peterson conference pre-game session. This week is the week of the conference, and woo, we're joined here by Lampe and Sky and Robert and Ann, and here I am. I'm Dave, or Lisa, on Facebook, and what should we say about this? Just that today we have presentations from Lampe and from Brent Cooper. And Lampe is actually a student here at Boise State. Brent Cooper is not able to make it today or this week, but made a video instead, which is really exciting because the more videos are on YouTube responding to Peterson, the better. NSP is the Critical Theory Club here at Boise State. We are trying to foster discourses that critique, undermine, and transcend capitalist realism and reactionary politics. With that, I will turn it over to Lampe, who's going to kick this thing off. Welcome, Lampe.
All right. So I am an undergraduate student in the sociology bachelor's program, and I'm in the Intermountain Social Research Laboratory at Boise State, where I use postmodern social theory to address neoliberalism in higher education. And so a lot of the Jordan Peterson stuff was hitting very close to home, and it was getting harder and harder to get away from it. Just the presence of it on the internet and in various circles of communication. And I want to start a lot of this with a sort of personal narrative about all of that, because Dave here, who I think we might try to have Francis canonized as the first atheist saint, decided that he wanted to do all of this with an air of respectability. And I made a video which was rather cleverly titled, "Jordan Peterson is basically garbage that can talk," which got him a lot of flack.
Me, like when I shared it, yeah,
yes,
it's true.
But the thing is, he's working very hard to make this a very responsible and respectable message. I am under no such duress and have made no such promises, because as far as I'm concerned, Jordan Peterson is a playground bully who has been attacking me on a personal level. And I responded in kind, because he has said of me, and people like me, that we have, and I quote, no human decency or ethics. That's not scholarly work. That is not a well thought out scholastic exercise. That's just being an asshole. And the reason I want to bring that up, even though I'm supposed to be addressing this book, is because Jordan Peterson represents a serious pedagogical problem. And so does Stephen Hicks's book, Explaining Postmodernism. So I want to explain, because to be perfectly frank, going into detail about the book would be a waste of all our time. And I mean this sincerely, because I've been trying to listen to the audiobook and it's garbage. But that's because it is not a scholarly work. In fact, I'm not sure that it was ever meant to be considered a scholarly work, and a lot of Jordan Peterson's work is not necessarily meant to be scholarly work. It's his own experiences, his own books, in a very unusual sort of way. 12 Rules for Life is not a scholarly work. That's not the title of a scholarly work. That's the title of a personal project, right? And Hicks's book seems to be the same thing. But the reason that Jordan Peterson is a problem is because people are giving the air of scholarship to his position because he has a Harvard degree and he's a professor. But ostensibly, that is itself a serious issue, because that gravity is not deserved by his approach. And people, when he says, I recommend this book, and starts talking about Stephen Hicks's Explaining Postmodernism, people go, oh, so that too is a scholarly work. And now the internet is filled with people participating in a conversation about philosophy today, which is extremely misguided, and they are terribly ill-informed, because that book was never meant to be scholarship. That book is ostensibly a political project with an attempt to give a historical account behind Randian objectivism, which is already a problem for Jordan Peterson, because the book attacks Jordan Peterson's methodology, his belief system, and even some of his favorite scholars, which leads me to believe that it's quite likely he's never read it, despite using it as his background for an attack on postmodernism and equating postmodernism with feminism, neo-Marxism, intellectualism, and putting everybody he disagrees with into one enemy camp, which Hicks did and included Christians when he did it, despite Christian normativity being a huge part of how Peterson operates. So this book is bad. It's bad for Jordan Peterson, and Jordan Peterson is bad because what he represents is a toxicity in the public exchange of information. People are now getting their first taste of philosophy through these works, and they are at best slapdash and at worst politically motivated attacks, which claim that anything outside of their ideology is itself misguided ideology.
It's the only ideology.
If I could chime in here with a little thing I read online, I can go out and find this. It's a Reddit post, so it's not the most verifiable thing ever. But it was essentially an analytic philosopher talking about, he teaches an intro to philosophy course at a university, talking about the issue with Jordan Peterson. And what he said was basically like, I have students who are fans of Jordan Peterson and who think that philosophy is kind of these two camps. And they come in, I'm an analytic philosopher, and even I don't like how he represents continentalists and postmodernists. And so when I try and teach them about Marx or about the postmodernists, instead of getting well-researched, well-thought-out papers, I get Jordan Peterson-style rants as papers that make no sense, and that naturally I have to give bad grades to, which feeds into their victim complex that they love to use, that academics don't want to give it to them, when in reality, I have no stake in this. I don't care about this. I'm literally just trying to teach them the history of philosophy. And Peterson has done such a thorough job of convincing them that Marx had no right ideas and that the postmodernists were only evil individuals that I can't even teach them about philosophy. And, he goes into this and, it definitely goes into the larger issue of conservatives feeling persecuted on campuses, which, we don't need to go into now, but I think it's definitely notable that there is a provable effect that Peterson is having on the study of philosophy, the study of sociology, and it is definitely a negative one.
So, in looking at some of the stuff that goes on there, like we're talking about a man who once used a definition for truth that was socially constructed in that it is what the majority believes is true, that is the source of truth, and then said that social construction is a myth because of the existence of lobsters. And that's the sort of like, there's no addressing that. And it's not designed to be addressed because he doesn't have to either. He doesn't have to address it or allow it to be addressed because he has all of these excuses for not meeting or dealing with people who disagree with him, and then claims it's because the postmodernists refuse to have discourse with him, which is a big part of what all this is about, by the way. And Hicks does something very similar in the book as well, where he starts talking about how anybody that has ideas that are against Brandon objectivism, which I think I might go into now. Brandon objectivism is, Ayn Rand, the libertarian saint, had this notion that you could boil all of philosophy down to those ideas which were good for libertarianism and those ideas which were bad for libertarianism. And what Stephen Hicks's book is basically an attempt to do is to lend a pedigree historically to that, using the history of philosophy. And so he has this camp of the religious thinkers and the non-religious thinkers, and that's his take on medieval philosophy. And the notion that there is rationalism and anti-rationalism or irrationalism, and that there is the Enlightenment and the Counter-Enlightenment. He also claims that the Counter-Enlightenment is led by Kant, which is one of the most ridiculous statements a person has ever made. No, it's really bad. Like I thought that some of the videos I was watching about that were misinformed, and that was where I started listening to the audiobook. It's not just caricaturization. He actually does that.
Oh, wow.
He actually takes apart Kant and uses, he makes claims that Kant was so extraordinarily religious in his approach that he was undermining rationalism on purpose, when they called him the all-destroyer for being the one who was dismantling metaphysics and the capacity to use rationalism to prove God exists. I mean, it's just nonsense. It's offensive nonsense. And it's being taken by these people as a sort of seminal work in philosophy, when all it was ever meant to do was to lend credence to the sort of pseudo-philosophies that came through the libertarian movement in order to sort of contextualize them. I mean, this is somebody that just dismisses Hegel at some point with the phrase, whatever that means. That's not something somebody does in scholarship, right? He owns the publishing house for the book that the book was published through. Yes, which is not because he just wanted to publish his own book. This had nothing whatsoever to do with philosophy. It just had philosophy in it. And again, I think this is probably more because he attacks Nietzsche, because Nietzsche is sort of like the one of the originators of the concept of a social theory, because he started talking about the slave mentality and the master mentality, and how the religions in Greece and the West started to make these social things happen. And Hicks attacks that as anti-rationalist. And then Jordan Peterson uses Nietzsche all the time.
Yeah, no, everything that he doesn't like in Foucault and Derrida, you can find in Nietzsche, who he loves.
Yeah, which makes no sense. And then that's one of the things that I have to say, why I keep repeating this, why the book is bad for Jordan Peterson. The book attacks everything about his methodology, everything about his approach. His Jungian mysticism is absolutely what Hicks is talking about when he says that people are doing things that are anti-rationalist. And yet they work together to sell as many copies of their books as possible, because they either don't realize that there's a conflict there, or they don't care. I know Hicks doesn't care, he's a libertarian. That's part of his philosophy, is that he shouldn't care if the person that he's working with is wrong. That's their problem. The problem is, or the thing about that he's worried about, is making as much money as possible, because what's good for him is what is good. That is Randian objectivism, like a kind of what is it? Psychological egoism, right? It's a form of psychological egoism. What is best for people is for the individual to do what is best for themselves, which only works as long as nobody has diseases or shortcomings or any kind of problem at all, and sort of disallows for the existence of societies based on the notion that rather there is only a collection of individuals.
Oh, also, Stirner would have laughed his ass off at Randian egoism.
Well, look, there's so much about this stuff that doesn't make sense when you look into it. And these people that they are indoctrinating aren't going to know how. But even on a very surface, very simple level, just the way that some of this stuff is written isn't even meant to have the air of scholarship that is being attributed to them, which is one of the reasons why I have been such an asshole about it, because I don't think that they deserve that level of treatment. And this presumption that because of their position they do has led to, Hicks's book has become a textbook for the people who mean to educate themselves, because the system is so corrupted by neo-Marxism, which is, by the way, a huge part of Jordan's own approach. Jordan Peterson's own approach is this idea, well, they're all a bunch of crypto-Marxists. So he's developed a lot of what he's doing with this approach of crypto-conservatism, where he can indoctrinate people into his concepts and ideologies. And this is not unscrupulous behavior, because the people on the left are doing no better.
Mm-hmm.
I could rant for hours.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good opening. Anything else you want to finish off before we turn to the video?
Are there any questions that anybody has about any of the specifics, particularly of that book?
Oof.
The citations are a mess. There's a lot of false, a lot of claims about statements being made historically that weren't true.
So is this Hicks book, what's it called again?
Explaining postmodernism.
Okay, is the Hicks book really the origin of this, of kind of this whole narrative about how Marxists, after the fall of Soviet Russia, could no longer be Marxists in public, so they kind of went, and they couldn't believe in class war the same way, so they went subterranean essentially, and redressed class war as gender and race identity politics, but then used lots of obscurantism in the process to like make it too confusing for anybody to really know what the fuck they're saying anyway. Like that narrative, is that, first of all, correct? That's kind of what Hicks is saying. And second, is this like the origin of it, or is this kind of like the summation, like the most concentrated place where you can find that narrative accessible? I don't know.
To my knowledge, it might be the first codification of that. There's probably very similar works around there that are also political in nature and not philosophical or scholastic. And that is definitely the way that Jordan Peterson is trying to use it. But mostly it seems to be more like trying to develop a historical dichotomy for objectivism and non-objectivism, individualism and collectivism, which, by the way, despite Hicks's consistent use of, is not something that is used in philosophy to describe any of these philosophers at all. In fact, almost all of them had to cross between all of these ideas consistently in order to produce most of their works. But the book having that shape is important because it's become a reference material for something that's actually been going on since the 70s. Which is this notion that since people started looking at what we might call the Western canon in a way where they're questioning not even its validity, but the sources of some of the materials, rather than viewing it as with an almost religious sanctity, especially Derrida. Derrida started a big stink. A lot of people really didn't like what Derrida was doing or how his methodology was out there, and there have been attacks on the notion of there being leftists in universities for some time. And what Jordan Peterson essentially is just carrying on this fight that most people sort of gave up in the 80s about how the new way of thinking about things is unmaking the tradition of Western civilization, which only people on the right ever really thought, because most people who are actually in scholarship have seen the evolution of these ideas over time and know that it's not revolutionary leftist nonsense, because the leftist nonsense movements were, outside of what had been going on socially and politically. So Foucault is not a stranger to things. I mean, you get a lot of this when you look at Sartre too, because people are like, oh yeah, well, Sartre was a communist. And so you have all of these ideas about what that's supposed to mean. And people start reading all of that into being and nothingness. And I mean, the table either exists or it doesn't when you get down to it. It doesn't matter whether or not the person who's looking at the table is voting for the Marxist or libertarian parties.
He's also so self-critical.
Yeah.
And Peterson makes it out to be like he was the last person to get off that bandwagon.
What
It's
a
like
weird
the guy
statement.
wrote a 2-volume critique of Marxism. Sartre wrote a 2-volume critique over 900 pages.
Oh, awesome. He was hated by French Marxists and always kicked out of the meetings because everyone was like, oh, existentialism allows for people to be happy while capitalism still exists.
Yeah, get
so
out.
Fuck you.
Saying even Jean-Paul Sartre had given it up, while the Communist Party was the second most popular party in France for another 10 years. And he was a member until the day he died, as far as I know. It's just, he made a lot of really bizarre statements that are just historically false about Marxism in general. And that's the reason why we had to go underground, is because the left had failed, which the left didn't fail. Like Stalinist Russia had a lot of problems. It doesn't mean the left failed. It doesn't mean socialism failed. That's the other thing too. Socialism is clearly dead because they can prove that socialism failed by not bringing up socialism very often. Like most of Scandinavia, the North Atlantic, the Netherlands, even Canada have got socialism as part of their definition in their constitutions now. Like socialism is alive and well. The United States is a socialist country, because we have Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. The federal highway system is based on the Autobahn. Like seriously, it's the poster child of socialist infrastructure. It is a socialist endeavor. This idea that socialism is communism is Stalinist Russia is so bizarre, but it makes it very easy for people like Jordan Peterson to just come in and say radically ludicrous nonsense and have people believe it, because it's how it's been ingrained in all these people. And this fight has been going on forever and ever and ever. And Hicks didn't start this fire, and Jordan Peterson didn't start this fire. They're both fanning the flames very, very hard, and in a way that is getting attention for for young people. And I think that's one of the issues there too, is because young people have been generally, I mean, even though they don't vote, which is annoying, they do have a tendency to be overwhelmingly left compared to the rest of the populations. But Jordan Peterson has found a way to get at what none of the American Republican Party's been able to do, which is to indoctrinate young people into that mindset and to find an in, which, you know, has a lot to do with trying to get laid, for example. A lot of 12 Rules is about how to get a girlfriend, essentially. And that's something that I don't think you were going to see a lot of conservative rhetorical positions on.
And, you know, the closest thing to compare Peterson's attempts to outreach to the youth is Turning Point USA. If you look at a lot of Turning Point USA's rhetoric about Marxism on campuses, it's mainly focused at explaining to boomers why their grandkids no longer call them, not why, you know, like why you're failing your class because you won't stop ranting about what an asshole Marx was.
Yeah. Anyway, a lot of it's really sort of, how can it be so wrong and still, that leads me to my major thing about Jordan Peterson, because Jordan Peterson is either a very clever, evil man or a person who is quite remarkably stupid given his experience and his position. And considering how he behaves, there's a lot of stuff he says that would give a lot of argument to either side of that concept.
Yeah.
But one of those things must be true, because he says things like, what was the one I was talking about downstairs? Is this thing from Maps of Meaning where he says that,
Oh, the helix.
yes, the helix. The helix in symbology, in mythology, is evidence of the fact that God not only exists, but imprinted DNA on the knowledge of DNA in the minds of humans. What? He actually uses that as an argument for the use of supernaturalism in a debate with an atheist, which was broadcast live on the internet. And I was like, what? How? How does that? And Hicks would hate that. Hicks would absolutely hate that. And that's fine. They do projects together, so why not? Ridiculous. But so like outside of any reasonable approach.
I think the biggest question I had was about you said that his theory of truth was this sort of democratic thing, then, you know, turns around to being like it's not constructed or whatever, that's postmodernist. Now, I suffered through the first debate Harrison he had. I think I might have done the follow-up too. And so I have a better idea of like his theory of truth or whatever, because they debate it, right? And that's not even close. So I'm not doubting that that's a characterization he might have made at some point or something, but I'm just curious about that. Where did you encounter him saying that, or was that like secondhand?
It was secondhand, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, his theory of truth is more just pragmatism. Really, it's just totally like fine. I actually think I probably share his basic theory of truth. I mean, at the most basic level, just to say that like most of the time, like what we think of as truth or what works, right? And that what works has been proved out over time through evolution, right? And there's just a lot of things where it's like that's not some fundamental, deep metaphysical fact of reality. That's just a habit in nature that, like, you know, trees go this way instead of that way or something like that. It's just like you can't really get anything about human culture out of that, right? There's no that's where his fashy sort of conservative traditionalist stuff comes in. It's like this idea that like part of our essential human nature is rooted in that nature, and that's where it gets weird.
So he didn't say
that's where it's weird.
He didn't say that truth is what the majority agrees upon.
I don't think so. Maybe.
Okay.
So he could have. But no, so so in those debates though, he's really arguing that that what is true is what essentially allows you to survive, right? And it's funny because like Harris gets him on something that should not have stuck. Harris is like, I don't think this actually like beats the argument or something, but Harris gets him with this one. He's like, well, okay, so let's just say a man kills himself because he finds out that his wife cheated on him. Are you saying that that was not true? That she didn't actually cheat on him? Because that being true led him to killing himself. Therefore, it must.
Because it's basically
Peterson's like, I don't know.
because he doesn't have a response if he's using evolution as his source for truth in human.
Yeah.
Peterson reminds me of something someone I ran it, or people you run into debate a lot, and that's the people who are really fucking good readers and they're really good at like creating these arguments. But the moment they actually have to use them, they're screwed because they play it out in their head when they're creating them. And they say, you know, like, well, I'm going against an atheist, so he's going to question everything I say about God, but he's not going to question anything I say about truth. So I'm just going to establish my principle of truth.
Yeah.
Then I'm going to bring in the fact that there is universal truth through God. But Harrison is, you know, he takes the standard debate route of everything my opponent says, I'm going to disagree with. And that's how I'm going to win, because he's not going to be able to defend against all of that, and he's going to get lost in all that. And basically, Peterson gets in there, and even though everyone thinks he's a great debater, because he generally goes against people he can predict, Harrison questions his definition of truth, and suddenly, oh shit, I can't disagree with that because that makes sense in theory, even though there's a very easy answer I can think of, and that's that you're assuming that a suicidal person can be rational, which I think which under Peterson's definition, you could simply say he's no longer being rational, he's no longer operating on truth principles.
Yeah, and also that what works for species survival over long periods of times is not going to account for extraneous instances of this here and that there, right? Which
also
could deviate from the rule.
Also, everyone seems to forget this about evolution. Evolution isn't survival of the fittest. It's survival of those who can live long enough to procreate.
Yes.
Anything beyond that, evolution doesn't give a shit about.
Yeah.
Or it at least has no power over. But yeah, there's a lot actually in what you were just discussing about the way that Jordan Peterson faces a lot of this stuff is also a lot about how Hicks's book is written. Because Hicks's book is written in such a way that there are times that he almost exclusively works in strawman arguments. Because he's not actually addressing anything specific out of postmodernism, which, I mean, a lot of the stuff he's talking about is actually like a post-colonialism or feminism.
Yeah.
And that's another thing too. Why didn't Hicks attack, oh, for crying out loud. Anyway, he chooses people to attack who themselves attack postmodernism because they're feminists, which again, I mean, Ayn Rand was a woman. I don't know why they have this tendency to be masculinizing about it. But he doesn't attack Judith Butler. Judith Butler doesn't come up in any of this stuff. They always wind up with people who are post-colonial feminists or just feminists in general, even feminists who are arguing against postmodernism as postmodern feminists and part of this evidence that postmodernism and feminism are one thing without touching Judith Butler at all, who is a postmodern feminist. I mean, I don't understand. That would be so easy to do. But for some reason, they take this really weird route, and it seems to be to caricaturize feminism and feminist thought. And of course, as Jordan Peterson points out, is Marxist because it's part of this identity politics that we supposedly invented. Even though identity politics have been around since identities have been. I mean, it's a huge part of how nationalism started was ethnic backgrounds. So that very notion is, I mean, if all of history starts at the 20th century, maybe.
No, if he had like the slightest interest in steel manning opponents, which is to say building up their arguments as strong as possible before taking them on, if either of them did, I do think Butler would have to be contended with. But,
Exactly.
but I mean, like
I literally have to steel man Peterson to talk about it.
Yeah,
you have to because the fans will make you, right? And my students on campus who are big fans of him, like they kind of like almost like they require that, right?
Well, it's not like they do. That's the thing, because what they're doing is based in an ideological approach that they mask. Because again, that's fair play, considering that's what they are accusing everybody else of having done. When Jordan Peterson says that we're all crypto-Marxists, and when Hicks says that postmodernism was necessary because communism failed. There's a specific phrase.
Yeah, and he also does break this down to that collectivist individualist like dichotomy, which I'm glad you pointed out is not something that any of these philosophers held, except for maybe Rand. But
most of the
it's such a it has no referent in the literature. There's no one.
The sociologists don't even do that.
It starts the case in point of someone who thought, like, let's bridge those things, you know.
Yeah.
Like,
well, and you know, like even the fact that Marx and Engels were friends with Stirner should be more than enough evidence for the fact that, yeah, clearly collectivists and individualists, as these people define them, weren't always at war.
Well, a lot of the concepts Hicks admits himself, and then sort of tries to give this historical background too. That's largely what this is about. This is a framework of Hicks's own creation in order to talk about Hicks's beliefs, essentially. And again, I think that's all it was ever really meant to be. This launching pad that Peterson has given it was never deserved, and it was never necessary. All it was ever meant to be. I mean, there were other libertarians that attacked the book on the grounds that it was too naked. You know, it was too other libertarians said, you can't say that on Kant doesn't work. The whole involved part around that, and now all of a sudden it's bigger than you would ever imagine it would be, because a lot of it's nonsense. And it never was sort of the limelight. It's not a scholarly work. It's not even meant to be opinion. But even have philosophy of that, where this modernize trying to understand all this, and he's like, I don't even understand how it can be so far afield. It's because it's not a scholarly work.
Scholarly works that aren't far afield, though. It's not like being non-scholarly puts you like so off base. It's just like I think that there is something fundamentally skewing their ability to think about these things, probably mostly rooted in their fear of being called racist, being called sexist, right? And so they self-centered in academic environments, self-censored in academic environments for so long, it made them stupid. No, I don't think that they are stupid people inherently,
No,
but like when Hannah Arendt talks about stupidity, or when Deleuze talks about stupidity, both of them are pretty close in that, you know, it's not stupid like this isn't some ableist claim. Like, no, stupidity is like you aren't humanizing the other, you aren't like thinking they have a genuine possible point, and so you don't, in your mental acrobatics and shadow boxing that you're doing, going through these debate kind of moves, you're not giving them any sort of real credence, and so it makes you dumb.
Yeah.
Well, what I'd also say is they identify what the problem is before they start constructing their worldview.
Yes.
Which means that, so you have Peter, so that's why feminists have to be postmodernists, because postmodernism and feminism are kind of what's causing the main issues for straight white guys. And as a straight white guy, I can attest to the simple fact that, yeah, like some of the things in my life that aren't exactly the greatest ever, which I don't really complain about because it's probably a good thing that they're no longer great, are because there's societal changes due to the forces of feminism working for greater equality, which also means, unfortunately, that us white guys have to get off our mound of gold. Seriously, we're like fucking dragons.
Well, what's about that too is like what people aren't seeing about that, and deliberately trying not to see about that, is that the better things are for everyone, the better things are for everyone. This idea in some of the weirder libertarian thinking that money comes from nowhere is extremely flawed. One of the basic principles of capitalism is that people have to be able to consume the products that you produce. And so if the only wealth in the world is held by a certain number of people who are within their, golden palaces, then there is no way for them to accrue wealth or grow wealth, because the society is stagnated and all the wealth is in one place. Nobody can buy your products. If nobody can buy your products, you're going to go broke too. You can't continue to live the way that you live with extreme consumption.
Well, remember that was even what happened in 2008. Was that every single rich person moved all their money into the Caymans and kept it in bank accounts, pulled it out of the stock market because they realized they were getting fucked. And instead of, just taking that money, Obama came out and was like, hey, poor people, middle class people, you got to pick up the slack. You got to start buying more. You need to get into the economy and revitalize
Well, there
it.
was even weirder stuff going on than that. And all of it was just some of this cockamamie stuff I was talking about earlier about this oligarchic, new world order version of capitalism that doesn't make any sense, where these people think that money just works by magic. Of course, it leads to collapse when they start doing this stuff.
Okay, let's break it off here. Unless anyone who hasn't said anything a little bit, do you have any comments, questions, criticisms to throw in before we start a video?
no. We're good.
That's a comment.
Yeah.
Great.
We commented.
How about you, Brent?
Is Lampe's video about explaining postmodernism? That's what the topic is.
Yes.
I'm just wondering
Yes.
if you watched Cuck Philosophy's critique of that.
Actually, his video is like a third of my video.
Okay, cool.
Uses it.
Well, like I said, I think that his take on that book was worth more time than the book. Because, well, yeah, the book is not, look, the Cuck Philosophy is coming at that from a direction of scholastic responsibility that Hicks never had when he wrote it, because that wasn't his goal, as near as I can tell. Hicks's goal was ideological and was self-expression. So when Cuck Philosophy came along and had to start dealing with it because of people's comments and because of Jordan Peterson, his take on that book is already giving that book a better, scholastic overview than Hicks did when he produced it.
Mm-hmm. If there's time, I was wondering if I could show a 15-second clip of Peterson. It's something I left out of my talk, but it's kind of relevant here because it relates to kind of what Peterson's background was in postmodernism in the 90s. Like, so that's when he finished Maps of Meaning. And in this clip, he says that at the time he knew basically nothing about postmodernism. And he thinks that postmodernism is peaking now for various reasons, but from an academic perspective, postmodernism peaked in the 90s. Like, that's when it was critiqued by Sokol, and then Richard Dawkins wrote a review of that book. So there was this kind of extant critique, also in a sociological textbook I have. Like, there was this kind of common sense that postmodernism was waning, right? So Peterson is like 20 years late to the game. And let me quickly just show this clip. It's just 15 seconds.
When I wrote my first book, Maps of Meaning, I was actually trying to solve the postmodern conundrum. But I didn't know that at the time because I wasn't particularly, postmodernism didn't have the tremendous, what would you say, widespread impact it has now, but I also wasn't that familiar with it.
I mean, it's Canada, so it's just like, I mean, it just got, postmodernism just got there real late.
Yeah.
And a lot of surreptitious through.
Maybe that's what we're not considering. He's Canadian. Maybe that's just the issue.
I think that
I'm Canadian.
Delivered in the mail, like
Drank bagged milk. That's got to do something, do you?
Something odd to me, like just really sort of conceptually bizarre about about Jordan Peterson and Stephen Hicks being Canadian, because everything about them just seems so un-Canadian.
True. Okay.
Yeah, I'm Canadian too, by the way, and so this is something that offends me personally about Peterson. He's making us look bad.
I read an article, and by the way, all of my extended family is from Canada. I go up to Canada every year, and my parents are immigrants, and so I read an article that made me realize, like, there's something to this, and that actually Peterson's kind of the quintessential Canadian uncle. He is totally that, because I have a bunch of these uncles. I'm like, son of a bitch, it's true. He's read a couple bigger books as well. Anyway, sorry, Brent. So the floor is yours. I can cue the video, but I'd like you, could you at least make an introduction for those who didn't meet you last week?
Oh, you're playing my video right now? I thought Lampe had one.
No, that was it. That was.
Oh, okay.
Oh no, we'd be here all night. No. No, he just came prepared to talk about it instead of. We'll just share that in the event stream after.
Okay. I'll just say one more thing on this point that we're talking about. I think the best critique about the fact that Peterson's Canadian was by Jesse Brown in the New York Times. The title was something like "Only Canada could produce someone like Jordan Peterson" or something. So that's worth referencing on this point. My video includes a self-introduction, so I don't have anything else to say. We can just roll it.
Fair enough. Yeah, and actually that was the article I think that I meant. And so if that one says what I said it says, then if it doesn't, then I was wrong. So all right.
If it wasn't, then he didn't say it.
Well, there you go. Yeah, that's very postmodern political.
There you have it. All right. So screen share.
Look at that.
Open the gates of the infinite
You might want to
regress.
stop that quickly. Your
Don't-
computer might actually.
Can you imagine? It just starts smoking and sparking. All right. Now I found some sweet video. Let's watch it.
Hey everybody. So I asked Dave way back if I could make my presentation and article submission different things, and he said that was okay. So I wanted to review everything I'd done already leading up to this point to give a kind of snapshot of the big picture rather than produce yet another novel take. The presentation and article sort of mirror each other but have different content. I'm honored to speak to such a conference. I think I'm in very good company, and I think equally it should be considered an honor for Peterson to have such a conference dedicated to him. But first I have to preface that my room is clean, so I can the self-introduction. So I have a degree in international relations from UBC and a master's from LSE in political sociology from 2011. Since then, I've worked odd jobs outside of academia and pursued research independently. I'm the founder of the Abstract organization, a virtual think tank that is essentially a media and research project at the crossroads of metafiction, art, philosophy, and social science. Under this umbrella, I produced a 36-minute film, which is a philosophical satire about abstraction, and I've written about 40 articles so far related to abstraction and metamodernism. I will be discussing what those things mean throughout this presentation. For about a year and a half, I participated in a private discussion group about metamodernism hosted by Hansi Freinacht of Metamoderna. There's some great stuff coming out by people in this network soon, and I'm actually going to Berlin in November to meet with some of them. So stay tuned. So I want to introduce myself vis-a-vis Peterson a bit because I'm very much like him in some important regards. Psychedelics, mysticism and myth, depth psychology, heroism, individualism, existentialism, self-actualization. These are things I'm interested in. I think I understand them pretty well, and I'm not challenging Peterson on these grounds. It'd be fair to say that I can relate to his developmental trajectory, his complexity, his interdisciplinarity, his hypervigilance even, but most importantly, his commitment to logos and truth-telling. And that is why we're here. There is a sort of David and Goliath situation between us and Peterson. We are slaying the dragon, speaking the truth, taking personal responsibility in our work. And Peterson, I think, should appreciate what critics and some millennials are trying to do here by sharing in some of his principles to critique him. So the irony here is that Peterson's logic is actually rooting for us. And, to some extent, he's expressed that in his interviews with Russell Brand that he wants the left to do better. And so it's precisely because we've listened to Peterson's guidance and logic, his commitment to logos, that I feel obligated to stand up to him as well. In mythical terms, you might say I'm trying to save the father or kill the father. Take your pick. It doesn't really matter either way. What is actually happening here is speaking truth to power. Parrhesia, specifically, which was mentioned already in the last presentations. So I think these sentiments are shared by a lot of us, and in the next slides, I'll get into the context for meta-analysis and discuss recent events. Quick note about this spreadsheet I've compiled. It's over 250 sources of critique, commentary, and of Peterson himself in interview with others. I've made this public and shared it in the Facebook group. This does not include his Bible or MAPS lectures, but there is a lot of required reading here, I feel. Too much to summarize. There's a lot of good critiques. It's only when you kind of step back and look at the big picture that you can weigh the critiques against the defenses. Obviously, a lot has been said about the Peterson issue, and I want to emphasize that the sheer volume and asymmetry of content that's been created around his discourse speaks to how divisive and polarizing he is. That is our starting point. And at this point and before, we should be doing meta-analysis, not necessarily coming up with more fresh takes of the situation. Recently, I wrote both a Reddit open letter and a private email to Peterson's staff. Peterson chose to respond publicly to the content of the private email, which wasn't addressed to him, and to ignore the Reddit open letter and the conference link, which was addressed to both him and his audiences. So begrudgingly, I'm going to quickly go through those and make a comment to give this presentation some more context. First of all, Doug Lane already analyzed this and responded to it and kind of clarified the situation that he and others had already reached out to Peterson as politely and professionally as you could do. But he was ignored and treated dismissively. I want to clarify something obvious here, which is I wasn't inviting Peterson to debate because we're way past that point. So it's telling that that's his response. And at the end of his reply, he says, and in case you didn't notice, we just had our debate. Well, no, we didn't at all. That's not what a debate is, and I don't want to debate. So because Peterson didn't like the tone of my letter, he used it as an opportunity to deconstruct the text and kind of annotate what I did wrong in approaching him. And what makes you so certain, Mr. Cooper, that you or any of your crew is serious? This is a great rhetorical question and insinuation that we are all not worthy. You have to love it because, you know, in my Reddit open letter, I said Peterson's going to get his comeuppance in the most fair and critical way. And you know, so he's going to have this question answered the hard way. We are serious. We're serious critics, serious academics. Based on this reaction, I think Peterson wants to happily slap the shit out of me like he does to Pankaj Mishra. And honestly, all we can do is turn the other cheek. But that doesn't solve anything. I wanted to quickly throw this up too. Dave shared it on the Facebook group the other day, and I thought stages 1 and 2 were a very apt description of Peterson's modus operandi. The first, playing language games and dehumanizing opponents, and then second, otherizing and avoiding anybody he can smear under the label postmodern neo-Marxist, which, by the way, doesn't really apply to us, the people critiquing Peterson. And to some extent, his entire project flirts with discrimination. Obviously, he doesn't personally advocate for it, but the expression of his project, starting with his self-victimizing position against Bill C-16 and extending to the dismissive and anti-intellectual tendencies of his online mobs. Moving on. This is the title and abstract I submitted for my article for the Zero Books publication. Jordan Peterson in a nutshell, the meta-conservatism of aggressive passivity and anti-progressivism. The 100,000-foot view of Peterson reveals a paradoxical and ironic figure, a man who claims to be apolitical, but amplifies conservative talking points in a time of conservative rule, who beats the dead horse of postmodernism while avoiding contemporary metamodern discourse, who is hyper-vigilant about personal responsibility, yet wants nothing to change structurally. And I'm certain he's going to say that's a mischaracterization, at any rate. He is very articulate, yet constantly misunderstood to his disdain, who is an apologist for Christian theology in a time of both theocratic politics and spiritual secular renaissance, who is a solipsistic fetishist of heroism, blind to his villainy to social justice, and who eats nothing but meat and happens to hate vegans. He is a nut in a shell that he has created, who expresses himself not passive-aggressively, but in an aggressive passivity, explosive antipathy to change and progress and the discourse of such. The nascent paradigm of metamodernism is invoked to address all of Peterson's ideological contradictions, and really explain all of modernism and postmodernism in a new framework, as well as to directly respond to his call for correction and critique. The fact that it is ignored and rejected by him and his audiences speaks to the complexity of the subject, but more importantly, to the resilience of the pseudo-intellectual status quo and the new reproach of abstraction. If Peterson is a man of his words, then his evolution into an actual progressive figure would be inevitable, but the prognosis is pessimistic. And although I say the prognosis is pessimistic, I'm trying to be more optimistic in this presentation. Peterson came on my radar as someone who mattered in terms of abstraction, because it appears central to his work, Maps of Meaning, which contains over 100 references to abstraction. But it quickly became apparent that there was a lot of ideology and anti-ideology packaged with that outside of the book. So Peterson gets abstraction right, in a sense, focusing on Piaget's notion of reflective abstraction. It's a key theme running throughout the book, and he invokes it in speech often to try to kind of articulate concepts. Because abstraction is essentially a thinking process, but it's also much more complex than that. So I wanted to take an approach to critique that nobody else was taking, one rooted in his work, not in his reactions and interviews. And I wanted to start kind of addressing him as a compliment. Piaget's type of abstraction describes the process of knowledge acquisition and thinking itself. And in Maps of Meaning, Peterson applies it to cultural evolution to explain how knowledge is first instantiated at the level of perception, then through adaptive behavior, on to play, ritual, drama, and all the way up to philosophy. Here you can see the benefits of reflective abstraction as Peterson describes them in the book. And I write, we need to continue to develop abstraction as an epistemology, a way of knowing and verifying. The larger point I want to make is if abstraction is mapping, and mapping is an increasingly objective, investigative process of revealing the matrix we live in, then how can we make correct maps more equally distributed? So to me, this is a matter of public sociology and world disclosure, not just evolutionary psychology. I finished the article saying, the abstraction of Jordan Peterson is his schematic worldview and his explicit use of abstraction, which is certainly more accurate than the average person. This is in part evident in his totalizing diagrams, which give due space to chaos and the unknown. His rise to prominence as a public intellectual in an anti-intellectual political climate is of great import, as it guides the agenda of intellectual discourse, for better or worse. We are going to need honest maps of meaning to navigate the 21st century, and his maps are one good place to start with respect to psychology and psychohistory. But Peterson is a bad place to finish. Here are some other articles I've written on abstraction. I just wanted to show this to give some context, because while Peterson gets abstraction right in one narrow psychological sense, there's an interesting field of related research. All of these can, in a roundabout way, be counted as subtle critiques against Peterson because they're outside the scope of his usage of abstraction. And throughout this presentation, I'll be lifting quotes from some of these articles to make my points. But I want to zoom in on one particular article because it employs abstraction contra Peterson. Benjamin Bratton is a digital philosopher, sociologist, and design expert whose work largely employs explicit abstraction. Like Peterson, Bratton has an unusually high rate of reference to abstraction, and they also both refer to it in terms of mapping, which I argue is a crucial epistemological advance. Abstraction is integral to Bratton's thesis, the stack on software and sovereignty. What is the stack? Quoting from the book itself now, Bratton outlines a new theory for the age of global computation and algorithmic governance. He proposes that different genres of planetary scale computation, such as smart grids, cloud platforms, mobile apps, smart cities, the Internet of Things, automation, can be seen not as so many species evolving on their own, but as forming a coherent whole, an accidental megastructure that is both computational infrastructure and a new governing architecture. Essentially, I argue that the stack and the mode of abstraction are highly metamodern for their embrace of reconstruction and the high level of awareness of developmental logic. Unlike Peterson, the stack appears to dovetail with Marxist analysis with its emphasis on the relations of production. This is also noted in another deep review by Mackenzie Wark, whereas Peterson disdains Marxism altogether for its postmodern incarnation. This is an important point of departure, as Marxism in the abstract sense is an indispensable approach to resolving the inequities and pathologies of capitalism, contrary to the caricature of socialism being inherently untenable and brutal. So I contend Bratton's approach fits within my definition of meta-Marxism. I reviewed this article called The Reproach of Abstraction. I'm not going to read this abstract, but I will try to translate it, quoting from my article. I say, upon further close reading, this abstract can be bolstered in layman's terms as such. 1. Philosophical abstraction produces claims of universal solutions. 2. Which are dependent on the integrity of shared concepts. 3. Whereas bad abstractions are one-sided and contrarian, causing confusion and reproach, good abstractions are clear representations of absolute ideas. 4. This refinement allows us to universally define very abstract concepts like global capitalist modernity, for example, as transdisciplinary objects, or more specifically, hyperobjects, I would say. 5, so that philosophy, i.e. abstraction, can further streamline discussion beyond the postmodern tools available to us through conciliating equivocal language to achieve universality and hence agreement. Universal paradigmatic consensus is the goal, so we can move forward. In other words, we need to have a common discourse and set of concepts to be able to relate intellectually to each other. And right now we can't do that with Jordan Peterson. And I bring this up because it appears to me what Peterson is doing is reproaching abstraction that he doesn't like. He's hand-waving away swaths of sociological research that he doesn't like, much of which he seems entirely unfamiliar with. Now we come to my second article, which is a critique, and it is longer. It's about 10,000 words. And at this point, I'm genuinely worried about Peterson and would like to see a course correction, because I knew that things were going to get harder for him in terms of the media. I put in the Jonathan Rowson tweet here because he's going to be important coming up in the next article and beyond. Rowson is the former head of the RSA, current head of Perspectiva. Both are UK think tanks. He's also a chess grandmaster. What the title is implying is that Peterson is a detractor as opposed to an abstractor, as I laid out in the first article. The main thrust of this article is that Peterson is ironically committing vicious abstraction himself about postmodernism and Marxism and other concepts, leaving out key details of the philosophies which he criticizes. This, of course, is a type of reductionism, but I prefer to call it vicious abstraction. Vicious abstraction is the term for a linguistic fallacy whereby some essential piece of information is removed. It is considered as part of a set of other semantic errors, including weasel words, equivocation. But I'm going to read from this definition from William James, hoping that the clout of a psychologist might make a difference for Peterson. It's also very applicable to this situation. Let me give the name vicious abstractionism to a way of using concepts which may be thus described. We conceive a concrete situation by singling out some salient or important feature in it and classing it under that. Then, instead of adding to its previous characters all the positive consequences which the new way of conceiving it may bring, we proceed to use our concept privatively, reducing the originally rich phenomenon to the naked suggestions of that name abstractly taken, treating it as a case of nothing but that concept, and acting as if all other characters from out of which the concept is abstracted were expunged. Abstraction, functioning in this way, becomes a means of arrest far more than the means of advance in thought. It mutilates things, it creates difficulties and finds impossibilities. And more than half the trouble that metaphysicians and logicians give themselves over the paradoxes and dialectic puzzles of the universe may, I am convinced, be traced to this relatively simple source, the viciously privative employment of abstract characters and class names. is, I am persuaded, one of the great original sins of the rationalistic mind. Oh my God. I want to hang on that last sentence for a minute and keep in mind what all of this means when Peterson is talking about Marxism or postmodernism or feminism, how he reduces them to a single pejorative sense. And not only does this ignore the extant literature that's actually out there, even literature that critiques itself, it forecloses the possibility of actual discourse. So my article critiques Peterson on these 10 separate grounds roughly, and I cite a lot of other work out there. So at this point, it's already very much a meta-analysis with just a little bit of my commentary sprinkled into it. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over it and go on to the next. So I wrote this article 6 months after the last one, and a lot more Peterson criticism had come out, as well as a lot of pro-Peterson stuff. So I wanted to go beyond the critique and try to resolve the paradox of Jordan Peterson. The title suggests a few more things: that Peterson is resolute, that he is a low-resolution thinker in some respects and a high-resolution in others, and at the time that there was no resolution to the conflict with critics and other intellectuals. It seemed to be inflaming the culture war. And so I explore these themes throughout the article. This table is, of course, dated now and a little bit subjective, but it's illustrative. And I write in the article, as you can see, probably no less than 24 commentators have voiced their opinion now on each side. It gives us an increasingly clear resolution of the paradox. But far fewer have tried to bridge the increasing divide and present Peterson's complexity in soft light. Furthermore, many have scoffed at my attempts to do just that. In this article, I cite some other critiques. I discuss his Zizek feud, add some new stuff about metamodernism, commend Peterson's reserved, thoughtful position on the Israel-Palestine conflict, and like Nathan Robinson, I opt to engage in a little satire. But I want to highlight my analysis of Peterson's encounter with Jonathan Rowson, because it was really a new turning point, and not in the sense of any growth for Peterson. I point out that Peterson is combative and dismissive of Rowson's respectful engagement, and you can see for yourself. I'll show some clips. But the point is that these interactions and the extant critiques against Peterson inspired Rowson to write a 10,000-word critique himself, which I'll show after.
The critique of you from, not the left, because that doesn't really help us, from sociologists, let's say, is that, look, you have enormous psychological depth, you're a charismatic, brilliant teacher, no one doubts any of those things, but you don't have any sociological imagination. You don't have any vision of how the world ought to be, or any sense of how we get there. You just want people to go and tidy the room. How do you answer that?
They should read the book, because that's just not true.
Well,
frankly,
I mean, it's an imagined audience here, but I've read the book, and to some extent, I think that is true. I mean, I sense enormous depth and insight. I mean, hugely admire your work, but I do feel well, I noticed two things. One is that, you know, if I may, you have wonderful folksy charm and a lot of composure when you're speaking about matters of the psyche, matters of religion, and when you're speaking about your own experience. Then I'm all in. But then there's often moments where you flip into the social and political domain, and then you feel this enormous latent rage and anger that doesn't feel in keeping with the rest of your character. And I wonder if that's because you don't know the material as well. That's how it feels.
Which material?
Political, cultural, sociological issues that are not as close to your core of expertise as the rest. So something like climate change, maybe artificial intelligence.
Well,
maybe,
I don't claim to be an expert on climate change.
You don't, but
sure.
No, I understand that. I appreciate it. And humility is
an expert on climate
no, they're
change.
not. I agree, which is a huge part of the challenge.
I'm also very skeptical of the models that are used to predict climate change.
That's also fine. And you mentioned humility as a key part of what we need to acquire, and I accept that. But it does rancor with many people that the sort of rage and anger you feels a bit misdirected. It's like if that could be channeled towards actually dealing with the complex problems we face, rather than attacking the people who trying in their own failing way to
when
deal with it.
the academics in Canada quit comporting themselves like they did in the Lindsay Shepherd case, then I'll stop being irritated at their existence.
You're an academic.
Jesus
Go ahead.
Christ.
So this was one of my longest essays, along with the article before it, which was a review of the book Metamodernism. Both of these articles were 14,000 words, so I felt I had more context established in arguing from and for a metamodern perspective. I attempted to show that for all their merits, aspects and statements of the IDW exhibit certain dangling threads of scientism, reductionism, contrarianism, elitism, hypocrisy, tone deafness, anti-leftism with aimless rightward drift, and indifference or antipathy to sociology as a discipline and social justice as a concept, all of which threaten to unravel their project. In the first section, I recount the history of the movement dating back to New Atheism and criticize Big Think's showcase of them. In the next, I note their subtle hypocrisy and the impossibility of critique, which leads into the next section. Free speech warriors expose their own pretense of wanting to listen and have real discourse. After that, I note some things that the IDW does right, and I critique the media coverage, specifically the New York Times spread and the blowback from that. And again, I invoke the discourse of metamodernism as the sweeping emergent paradigm that all of them are disinterested in or late to or oblivious to, however you want to look at it. And of course, the left has also not picked up on this, and that is my biggest lamentation. I can't just criticize the intellectual dark web without also criticizing the left, because metamodernism is still a relatively apolitical niche theory. So finally, we get to the fun stuff. But the first thing I have to say is that this is a huge topic, so I won't be able to do it justice in a few minutes. But I'll go over some key points. And here's a couple key sources. Robin van den Acker, Vermeulen, and Gibbons edit the volume. Metamodernism, Historicity, Affect, and Depth After Postmodernism, which I playfully call the Dutch School for simplicity's sake. And The Listening Society, A Metamodern Guide to Politics. Broadly speaking, the Dutch school defined their metamodernism in terms of Jameson's analysis of postmodernism. Namely, whereas Jameson showed how historicity, affect, and depth were waning under postmodernism, they have returned in metamodernism, expressed mostly through art and culture, according to their depiction. In this way, metamodernism is a direct response to the cultural zeitgeist of postmodernism, which peaked in the 90s. Hansi Freinacht, on the other hand, refers to metamodernism as a cultural stage, developmental phase, and philosophical paradigm. And I have my own ideas about it, which are more akin to this description, but we'll set those aside for now. Citing from my review article of the Dutch School, I'll explain the periodization. The book Metamodernism opens by historically situating the emergence of metamodernism in the 2000s, a time frame they pinpoint as 1999 to 2011 as particularly formative. They define what I count as 7 major features and global trends of this period as 1. Ultra-globalization, 2. Right-wing populism, 3. Fourth wave terrorism and war, 4. Awareness of the Anthropocene, 5. Financial crises, 6. Technological deployment, mainly the internet and social media, and 7. A 4th quantum leap in capitalist productivity, and a 4th update of capitalism, which is the move to post-capitalism. And to tie it back to Jordan Peterson, in my review article I write, I've tried to make a metamodern case study out of Jordan Peterson, whose explicit anti-postmodernism using a straw man and vicious abstraction of other superordinate concepts suggests that he is both unaware of and at odds with any notion of metamodernism. I approach him from the superposition of both fan and critic. Therefore, the debate over him and his anti-postmodernism, anti-Marxist quest seems like a very appropriate place to inject this new theory. A limitation with the Dutch school approach is that it doesn't address the problem of postmodern politics, which Peterson is dedicating his energy towards. And this is something that we're addressing in our work on metamodernism and is being addressed in other leftist commentary. And there is proof that he is both unaware and disinterested.
Hello, Jordan B. Peterson, huge fan. In your lectures, you use the term postmodernism interchangeably with cultural Marxism, nihilism, and moral relativism. I wonder if you've considered or heard alternative beliefs that the term postmodernism is not necessarily always congruent on a one-to-one scale with these other terms, and in some limited circumstances is positive. Specifically, the idea that when you use the term postmodernism to vilify is by some others referred to as pseudo-modernism, whereas some would call what you endorse to not be modernism, but in fact metamodernism, postmillennialism, or postmodernism, which unfortunately has a terrible name. And then I have very brief definitions of those words if you need me to.
Well, no, I just want to point out here that it's a really good question, and Peterson gives a really non-answer, I'll say. Breaking down the question, he's basically suggesting that Peterson is using a straw man of postmodernism and asking how much he's considered this position, and then follows up with references to pseudo-modernism, metamodernism, postmillennialism, and postmodernism, which, as the questioner offered, there are specific definitions for. Peterson's answers were essentially avoiding the substance of the question.
As I said tonight, you have to give the devil his due, and so we'll do that. So yes, there is a very large number of ways of interpreting the world. There's no doubt about that. Yes, people use biased interpretive lenses as means of interpreting the world, to put their own priorities forward without necessarily knowing that they're doing so, and that can corrupt them and society. The psychoanalysts figured that out way before the postmodernists, so they don't get any credit for that. Like, really.
It's almost like the psychoanalysts influence the postmodernists.
So it's useful to keep those things in mind. It's when they're put forward as absolute truth that disturbs me. It's like, yes, people are probably racist. They might even be implicitly racist, although we don't know what that means, and we don't know how it's related to their explicit behavior, and we can't separate it from in-group preference or necessarily from reaction to novelty. So it's a tricky business, you know, and we don't know how to separate stereotypical racial perceptions from perceptual heuristics. We don't know how to do that, because you're always oversimplifying the world, because you're not smart enough to live in the world as it is. You have to oversimplify it. So yes, there are times when postmodernism is useful. I used it quite usefully tonight to deconstruct postmodernism, in fact. So, but it's when it's turned into an absolute, especially a moral absolute, and when it allies itself with Marxism, it's like, sorry guys, no, you don't like grand narratives, you don't get to go there. Well, that isn't where you went, that's where you came from. You never left there. So that's basically what I have to say about that.
Thanks.
What did you say?
That's what I have to say about that.
So Seth Abramson is a metamodernist who's gone after Peterson in at least a couple Twitter storms. Here's a couple of good excerpts where he talks about Russell Brand. And here's Russell Brand thinking that was interesting. Okay, so finally we come back to Rouse and his piece. And I cite this because Rousen is in metamodernist circles, not because he has invoked it explicitly. So that is not to say he is comfortable with the term metamodernist, but he is informed. The cultural pressure to endorse or reject public intellectuals wholesale is problematic, obviously, because it can perpetuate groupthink and diminishes scope for intellectual growth, societal maturation, and political imagination. On encountering public figures who appear to be both right and wrong, sometimes simultaneously, perhaps dangerously, there is scope to be more creative and less reactive in our response. In the illustrative case of Jordan Peterson, commentators often orient their analysis with a conceptually moribund political spectrum. E.g., Peterson is alt-right, attacking the radical left. Social media echo chambers lead some to read that Peterson's fanboys are misogynist trolls, while others hear that his critics are virtue-signaling snowflakes. And the tendency of print and broadcast media to seek a defining angle tends to diminish rather than distill complexity. For instance, Peterson's fame is related to a perceived crisis in masculinity, but that is not the whole story. The coinage Petersonitis is introduced here as a serious joke to describe the intellectual and emotional discomfort that arises when we seek a fuller understanding of complex characters in a divisive political culture. In an echo of Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, 12 relatively dispassionate perspectives on his contribution are offered as an antidote to the language of allergy and infatuation that has surrounded his rise to fame. Peterson is described here as symptomatic, multiphrenic, theatrical, solipsistic, sacralizing, hypervigilant, monocular, ideological, Manichean, Piagetian, masculine, and prismatic. First-person language is used to reflect the author's experience of Petersonitis after being drawn to Peterson's online video lectures, debating with him in a public forum, and gradually clarifying the nature of my disappointment in his outlook and approach. It is hoped that the white paper will help readers recognize, recover from, and ultimately transcend Petersonitis to appreciate the wider application of the idea. Which leads us to Ronan Harrington's video, which I'm going to close out this presentation with. I'm just going to say a few words on it first because a team of us worked on this pretty hard, and between the two brand videos with Peterson, we did a lot of analysis that had to be left out. There was enough for 2 more videos and then some. The video got 80,000 views on Facebook, but didn't really get any traction on YouTube or Twitter. It didn't reach Brand or Peterson, and the feedback we got on the Alter Ego page was mostly positive. The feedback on Jordan Peterson Facebook groups was pretty uniformly negative, as it has been on all my work, confirming that even a mild critique, which gives Peterson a lot of credit, does not appease his base. Ronan followed this up by appearing on Emerge podcast with Daniel Thorson, which I highly recommend, as well as having conversations with David Fuller and Andrew Sweeney about this video.
Have you made up your mind about Jordan Peterson? It's stressful because he's a complex figure that's both profoundly right about some things and strangely off about others. Yet either way, we face an enormous cultural pressure to either endorse him or reject him, to love him or to hate him. And this speaks to the biggest problem in politics right now, which is that all of us are stuck in an either-or mindset. It's become more important to display loyalty to our political tribe than it is to understand a person or an issue in all of its complexity. I'm Ronan Harrington, and I'm exploring the new politics that's on the other side of this culture war. And I see Jordan Peterson as a test case for getting there. It becomes more apparent what to make of Jordan Peterson, his strengths and his weaknesses, when he appears alongside a more left-leaning figure who is open and willing to engage him in dialogue. Luckily, we've had that opportunity through a series of conversations he's had with Russell Brand. In this video, I'm going to compare and contrast Brand and Peterson on the issue of power and how we change society. And to do this, I'll be drawing on metamodernism, a stage of political thinking that comes after modernism and postmodernism, integrating and transcending them. So let's start with lobsters, and by that I mean hierarchies. Peterson talks a lot about dominance hierarchies, and he generally sees them as natural, productive, and meritocratic.
But if you play out the value in a social landscape, you're going to produce a hierarchy. And the problem with producing a hierarchy is that a small number of people are going to be more successful than the majority, and a very large number of people aren't going to be successful at all at that particular thing. It's inevitable.
Brand, on the other hand, tends to look at elite power structures and their pathological tendencies, seeing them as more threatening than the college campus culture that Peterson detests.
But I feel that we're already being subject to a kind of invisible tyranny, that it's already happening. And I don't think it's happening as a result of like some critical theory, post-Marxist. Like, I feel that that's not where power is. That feels like it's sort of bullshit, but it doesn't feel like it's as fucking powerful as GlaxoSmithKline or like, you know, it's not as powerful as Halliburton.
Peterson has some sympathy for this leftist position.
And so I've been concerned about what's happening in the university on the radical left. And your concern, the concern that you just brought up, is something like overwhelming large-scale corporate dominance. And I think that's also a reasonable set of concerns.
But he doesn't think there's much we can do about large-scale systemic change and fears attempts at doing so, associating them with failed communist projects.
You better bloody well watch out, because when you radically make things egalitarian, you're going to wipe out all your productive people, and then you're going to starve.
Instead of focusing on structural solutions, Peterson has a deep conception of what a moral code looks like for society, and believes in individuals who have purpose and are aiming in something higher. He simply believes that we need more competent and trustworthy people in positions of power.
See, I think the most effective solution to that problem is to have the economic system run, let's say, by distributed individuals who are themselves aiming at a higher good. So I think the most effective way of regulating the market, so to speak, is to improve the moral character of the people who make up the market, rather than directly regulating the market. And not that the market doesn't necessarily need some regulation, because you might say,
but this is already the system that we have. Meritocracy has become corrupted and is rewarding bad actors. Think about the technocrats and the elites who vie for positions of power over society. They have lost touch with moral systems of self-regulation because of our wider culture and our structures, and Brent points this out.
But I also believe that if you have a society that's predicated on some of the worst aspects of human behavior, lust, desire, fear, if lust, fear, and desire are so high in the mix, if you're continually being prompted towards onanism and consuming, I think it's that individual improvement will be insufficient.
In these conversations, we see Brand again and again emphasizing the realities of market failure, crony capitalism, rent-seeking, and the extreme inequality that leads to troubling imbalances of power and perverse incentives. We therefore cannot rely on individual improvements alone, as Peterson suggests, because the problem is structural. We all know what happens to good apples in rotten barrels. And this speaks to the nagging doubts that progressives have about Peterson. He seems to underestimate systemic forces and exaggerate fears about any collective attempt at correcting them. Most of the major global problems that we face are the result of collective processes that require intervention at a systems level. Imagine trying to solve climate change, mass migration, and income inequality at the level of individual virtue and good behavior alone. Yes, if more people took individual responsibility, the world would be a better place. And Jordan Peterson has made a profound contribution in this area, but that's hardly enough. There are many powerful systems in place that are self-protective. They actively defend themselves against change and reform. And to upend these unjust power structures requires more than just wise individuals. It takes the wisdom and the force of enormous groups of people working together. Peterson is right that there is a shadow of authoritarianism in social justice movements, and that activists need to do inner work to recognize the victimhood and the moral superiority that lurks behind their virtue. But it is farcical to think that any attempt at collective action is going to result in Stalinism or the Gulag.
How could you miss?
And Peter's paranoia of what he calls postmodernism simply leaves us with a vision of progress that's about individuals bettering themselves. There's no shared vision or shared goals. There's no sense of the meaning that is to be found in making the world a more just place. So ultimately, it's an impoverished vision of what it means to be a developed person. And it's a vision of politics and of human life that we simply can't afford right now. We've done a lot of homework to make these videos, but the best thing we have read is 12 Perspectives on Jordan Peterson by Jonathan Rowson. If you want to learn more about metamodernism, read The Listening Society by Hansi Freinacht. If you want to see more of these videos, support us on Patreon. Thank you.
I want to bring it full circle now. The title of this conference is Responding to Peterson, an intervention in lieu of a debate. So what is an intervention? It's action taken to intentionally become involved in a difficult situation in order to improve it or prevent it from getting worse. That doesn't sound fun, but that's exactly what we're trying to do. There's nothing malicious or presumptuous about this conference. This conference is the logical, considered response to Peterson and the intellectual dark web's ongoing controversy and divisiveness, while necessarily assuring that they are right about many things and a higher synthesis is possible. If If we're to consider an intervention in a more serious sense, that of intervening on behalf of a drug addict, in this case an ideological addict, our form of treatment is the open invitation to discourse, not debate, not interviews, but discourse, meaning common ground and critical collective inquiry and in-depth discussion beyond the current dialogue. This means being read up or briefed on metamodernism and other topics. This means engagement in things like immanent critique, parrhesia, which have already been introduced in this conference. So I want to end with a message to Peterson, which was a line from my original abstract submission for this conference. The critique against the left from within the left is already extant without his contributions. Because of his misinformation and authoritative rhetorical style, his presence only inflames tensions and makes it harder for the left to resolve its issues. End quote. I think it's been said a lot in one way or another, but all this Peterson drama is running interference for fundamentalist right-wing policies, up to and including those coming directly out of the White House. In a simplistic sense, this is why Peterson gets associated with the alt-right, but in a very grounded, dangerous sense, that's why this drift towards conservatism is insane. It is my realistic hope that our intervention here and the discourse of metamodernism can explain how the legitimate left can consolidate political power and unite progressivism. It would be great to effect a profound change of mind in Dr. Peterson, metanoia, but we cannot control this or expect it. We are trying to gray pill him, but we cannot change Dr. Peterson. But we can change the left. I'd like to end with a shout out to the conference. Props to Dave/Lisa for organizing. This is no small task. I'm a big fan of Michael Brooks and Doug Lane, who are great thinkers and media figures in their own right without the Peterson criticism. But said criticism has been absolutely on point. This is not about debating, but the fact that Peterson refuses to listen in on this discourse, to pay attention to what or who he criticizes. Peterson combines regressive liberals and progressive leftists into the term radical leftists, and that is at least one piece of dogma at the root of misunderstanding everything. This conference is academic, but it also has some elements of a roast, because some of the participants, like Peter Coffin, Michael Brooks, and ContraPoints, have been mixing their cutting critiques with comedy in this way already. I'd like to coin this as roast modernism. It's because you respect and admire them in some way, not because you are resentful or scornful of them. This is also the case when you carefully critique someone. These things should be kept in mind by us and the Peterson community. I have to admit that the comedy is a large part of the fun because he deserves every bit of it. But roasting only actually works if the subject submits themselves to it, as they do in the Comedy Central roasts. Maybe Joe Rogan could set that up.
We tried. We emailed him. Great. Thank you, Brent. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
I think we have time here still for well, okay, so we're at time as far as like the time we were going to go to, but it would be nice to spend another 10 minutes if everyone's not opposed to allowing folks to give some feedback and commentary.
I'll go as long as you guys want. I appreciate your patience with the long video.
A lot of good stuff in there.
One thing I kind of wanted to, that I noticed, and I'm not exactly saying that, well, I guess I am saying I disagree with your characterization of the response to Peterson. And that's not to say that I think that your video was wrong. I think there were many great points in it. But I think you kind of abandoned groups like Antifa when you made that point about the authoritarian left, because when you were making that point, you showed images of Antifa, which I think does not recognize what that movement represents and its defense of the left and of the world. And I think I'd go into a greater thing to say that I disagree with your characterization of we shouldn't be seeing it as two camps, two political tribes. And I would actually say that is how we should be seeing it in dealing with Peterson, And this is my personal thing. I'm not speaking for the conference here, but I'm saying that when I come to approaching Peterson, I'm approaching him as someone who is ideologically and morally opposed to me.
Yeah.
And that is because if we follow Peterson's ideology, people will die. People will continue to die. More people will die because of climate change, because of his skepticism on climate change, and because of his adherence to hierarchies. And I'm perfectly fine with calling that a moral issue. I would actually say that's one of my main issues with the modern left, is that they try and avoid moralizing when no, actually now is the time to moralize. And while I understand the want to avoid dehumanizing the right, which is something I work on constantly to make sure I'm not dehumanizing them, I also think that there's a certain necessity in saying, no, these people are wrong, and we aren't going to be able to debate them into agreeing with us. We aren't going to be able to discourse them into agreeing with us. When I come to this conference, I am, at least I see it as I'm engaging with Peterson because he wants to stand in the academic circle and say these things, and the academic circle is about discourse. I'm not doing it because I personally believe in a political sense that I should be taking this time. And so I think that Peterson as an academic is important to respond to, but Peterson as the political person, as the political ideologist, is something that should just simply be reviled. And I think that you would obviously disagree with that. I don't want to put words in your mouth, of course.
No, I'm more sympathetic to everything that you just said. So for the video, it was a team project, right? And I had nothing to do with the editing. I do agree with Ronan's and Jonathan Rowson's kind of approaches and positions, but my personal approach in my critiques is more unforgiving of Peterson. And so I'm more aligning with what you're saying, like we need to be more unapologetic and just clear in what we're opposing in Peterson. So yeah, I hope there's no confusion there, hopefully.
All right, thank you. I was kind of curious about that.
Well, I think that there's something to be said too for the notion that there are different ways that something like Peterson has to be responded to, because, well, first of all, Peterson's attacking practically everything. Between Peterson and Hicks, there's hardly anybody left without a scratch on him, including one another. It's true, because Peterson's concepts don't necessarily allow for an ideology that has no Christianity in it, and vice versa. Hicks doesn't allow for his. And so if we're looking at it from that perspective, this whole thing winds up being that if they're going to declare war on every front, then every front is going to respond. And so there is a place for somebody to have this response from the philosophical community, a response from the sociological community, a response from the playground by a pissed off asshole in a Marx t-shirt, which is of course mine. And that's inevitable because of how this has been executed, because this is not typical scholarship. This isn't people debating things vis-a-vis a shared journal that they're going back and forth in. This internet videos made by small timers in response to a huge phenomenon of a social nature that just happens to have somebody with a PhD in its head. That's the point that I've been making about all this. There's so much about this that goes so far outside of typical scholarship that needs to be addressed, but so does the rest of it. And there needs to be many fronts for this and many approaches to respond.
I want to throw in, though, just a follow-up on, so let's just set aside the fact that it was Antifa footage, because if you know anything about it, and this is no one in this room is implicated here, but if you know anything about Antifa, and they're not authoritarian, they're anarchists, right? So there's not, no authoritarian leader there, right? This isn't Mussolini's like, black shirts or whatever. But I mean, that's the way it's always played off, right? But that, that I think that there's a valid conversation to be had about optics, right? Do we act like we're in the midst of a revolution if we're not? And do we get full of moral superiority just because we're doing what's right? Right. So this is like more the difference between having a strong moral basis and saying we're going to stand on those principles and saying we're going to keep pointing back at those principles versus getting so full of our, like, this sort of like moralizing wind in these sails. Like, they're not, like, those don't have to be the same, and they don't have to be conflated. So I think that we can have a strong moral basis and be like, no, we're trying to take the moral road here, and at the same time not be like falling for the oh, but now we're so righteous kind of thing. And so if that I honestly don't know. I don't think that this abstract term, the left, is something that's currently really like owned, as far as like YouTube discourse, at least, by the anti-PC SJW industry, right? And they've given us that appearance. They've cherry-picked the lowest hanging fruit from the left, or anything that looked like the left, and said that generally represents the left. And there is some shit there that they've, that they draw off of that's absolutely reprehensible, and I wouldn't want to be affiliated with it, right?
I've seen skeptics do that with postmodernism too.
Right. So it's like I don't if it's just like this catch-all, I wouldn't want to. It's like I do want to disassociate myself from that thing that, for instance, any normie who spent like a little bit of time watching Rubin or something has like this impression of. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have to try to rise above that. I think metamodernism is the kind of vehicle to do that. That's a bit simplistic sounding without having more context. But I at least was hoping to kind of introduce it and legitimate it through this presentation, because there's a lot more sources than what I've shown, and there's a lot of conversation and the approach that Rowson and Ronan were taking publicly is kind of, it's nuanced and it's diplomatic, but there's no way to kind of extract a metamodern paradigm just from watching those approaches. There's a lot more to it. There's a whole social theory behind it. And I tie metamodernism to more concrete things like evolutionary globalization, for example. Like, there's just a lot of different scientific fields and theories out there that aren't getting a lot of play because Peterson and the intellectual dark web are dominating the conversation.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's something that needs to be addressed too, because like I keep saying, it's a pedagogical problem at this point. Scholarship and universities, and this is my work in IMSTRLs about this right now too, is that scholarship is operated a certain way. The veracity that is inherent in the system is operated under a certain way until very recently. And now there's custom programs that companies come in for their employees and things like that. Jordan Peterson's another version of this, where, or Donald Trump, another example is Donald Trump going to Twitter instead of dealing with the usual ways of communicating with the public. And so now that there's this direct line to the public from these people, they're sidestepping all of the things that used to legitimize them. But yet their legitimacy is maintained in certain circles by people that we have to somehow find a way of addressing, who aren't going to come to us because they think that we don't talk to other people who disagree with us, when they're in fact being indoctrinated for business. Or learn from us, or come to us.
I want to rewrite my paper now. I want to write a different paper. This is, the last few pregame sessions, for anyone who hasn't seen all of them, like, I think lay a really good basis for operating in this weekend. And so I do hope that people take the time to go back and check those out, because there's been, these two presentations were great, and the other ones that have already happened were also like really, I think, laid a strong like groundwork. And but the reason I say I like read another paper is because this whole thing on stupidity that we talked about earlier, about stupidity being this not being open to, not being vulnerable to criticism, and not being willing to be wrong, and not being willing to go out on a limb and say the damn thing that might get you called the ism that you don't want to get called, how that creates these sort of like negative with these positive feedback loops in it, where you get trapped into this sort of like canned discourse where you're arguing with this made up enemy that you then confirm with some data from the world, right? Like, and part of it, so, and I want to tie this into something else though, like, so I don't think it's useful to call him evil. I think that there's evil in this kind of ideology, but that I just know too many people, they're also fans of Peterson, who think a lot like him. And at the end of the day, I always hope that things like interventions are able to kind of break through some of this stuff, because the fact is like, if there was a revolution tomorrow and then there was like literal fascism versus some other thing, and then I was a part of that other thing, then there is no talking. But like, we're not at that point. And so there is the possibility there. And so I do have a like hope, but where was I going with that?
Your new paper?
Huh?
Your new paper?
Yeah. No, just this, I do think that when so I come out of a conservative household, and I really was avoidant to have difficult conversations for a long time, still am in many ways. And I try to like, to push back against that tendency. And part of it is that if you are hyped up on an ideology that's predicated on fear, that says that these people, not only are they out to undermine everything you care about, but that if you say X, Y, or Z things, they're going to not like respond to you. They're going to like scream at you or try to shut you down or humiliate you or anything like that. And then you have like this sort of caricature in your mind. And then anytime you actually do say something that triggers somebody, and then but you're in this headspace, all of a sudden it's confirming like this idea that you have, right? Instead of learning to have conversations about things and break through those stereotypes you have of the other, you end up in this self-censor loop thing. And I think that's like, that the people who are the biggest Peterson fans who I've given up on having conversations with at this point, it is because it's like they always think they know what I'm going to say next, and they don't.
Well, it's poorly serving them.
They never do.
It strikes me as being like a martial artist who's only ever read books about martial arts, who's never sparred. How useful are they going to be in facing their enemies if that's how they do it? And they don't really have it.
Yeah, and on that note, Peterson's like, he's kind of like somebody who just spars all the time and doesn't read books on martial arts. Like, he's really good at
yeah.
He's really good at debate, and rhetoric. And that's kind of what we have to overcome. And everything you said there, Dave, was really beautifully put. And you're good at synthesizing this stuff. And it speaks to a lot of my work too, which is about kind of anti-intellectualism, because Peterson is an intellectual in a lot of ways, but what he's doing, the way he's behaving, is anti-intellectual to the core. And this is what the research on anti-intellectualism kind of spells out too. And so it's super ironic that Peterson, he's emphatic that he's not ideological because he's studied ideology, like he studied it in depth. And I get that. There's a lot of research out there on ideology, right? And you kind of overcome things by studying them. But clearly, he's still missing a lot because he is ideological in some important regards, and
the philosopher of ideology par excellence of our times is Slavoj Žižek, who he's not read.
Right, exactly.
thing about that.
Zizek's written 50 books, and I can't say that I've read them all. And Peterson's probably not read any of them yet. Peterson wants to debate him. You know, like, where does that come from?
Right.
Well, Peterson doesn't want to debate him. He ran away when he do it.
Precisely. And, you know, it's a good thing that he did. If he had tried to, the illness that has kind of basically taken Zizek out of the game right now would have. I'm glad that basically Peterson failed to follow up on the response, because Zizek's like, I'm down. And then Peterson, radio silence for like 2 months. And then the illnesses all hit Zizek. If Peterson had said he would, he could have looked like the good guy here. But missed the boat.
I don't know. I feel like Zizek would die on stage if it was
Yeah, it's a scary prospect, because it's billed as like the fight of the century, right? And that's what some of these audiences want to see, but that's not intellectual resolution. You know, it's the opposite.
No, and one of the most frustrating things about that as well is it puts them on this equal footing where it's like, oh, look, we have two great thinkers of our times.
Yeah.
No, like Slavoj is very much a cartoon of himself on YouTube, and he says that, but he's got original and literally like hardcore, like Hegel, Lacan level, you know, original philosophy, not this, anti-intellectual appealing. So he really, taking it back to the intellectual thing, Peterson's really, if you watch for the rhetoric of trying to appeal to the populace who doesn't read, he does that, right? Like everything he does, like he takes very simple insights and says that he's thought about this for months and it plagued him. And then he said this thing, and it's like, well, that's a basic thing everybody knows. What are you talking about? But he's like he's overhyping it to like, this is so complicated. As well, a lot of what you're talking about is not complicated. But, you know, this is the rhetoric of how you speak to people who are averse to academic discourses, period. And that he's, you know, started wearing pleats and all this stuff. He talks about his pastoral style. Like there are a couple articles going around about how his style has changed to appeal to this broader audience. And that he's literally said it. So the one thing I wanted to touch on with the anti-intellectualism is that, one, nobody likes someone who's going through a relativist phase, like where it's their new thing and they just realize that there are things that are culturally relative, and then they inflate that onto all things, right? And at the same time, like nobody likes the state of the university today. He's basically able to, in one fell swoop, take both of those problems, the failing university, the bludgeoning neoliberalization of the university and its bureaucracy, and then at the same time, relativism, which has been a problem for every student who's trying to think through things ever, and say, well, those are both just all, in sum total, the problem of postmodernism. Thanks, Derrida.
You can also bring into that too, and I think often does this sort of like, it's okay that you don't have a college degree. It's like there's a lot of people out there with a persecution complex about intellectualism in general.
Totally.
And he's able to speak to that by being like,
well, it's garbage anyway.
Yeah, he's turning on his own kind in that regard in order to help them. It's like an anime thing. Like that's what the anime heroes do, because the villains are these super powerful things that he turns around and defends humanity against them.
Well, remember when I mentioned earlier that, you know, it speaks to every conservative who's ever failed a class because they felt they were conservative.
Yeah.
And, you know, the best example of this was this girl who, I think she was a TP USA person, but I know TP USA like signal boosted it, who like tweeted a paper that she got failed on where she talked about like her conservatism. And she's like, well, my professor failed me because I'm a conservative. And you read the paper, it wasn't even third grade level. It was that bad. Like, I would honestly advise that the university straight up kick her out for how bad.
Save your time, save your money.
It was embarrassing. And what it really is that a lot of these conservative people, you know, everyone loves to say, well, you don't have many conservatives in academia. I'd argue that's because a lot of conservatives aren't the type of people with the rigor or rhetoric to be able to make it.
Well, I mean, there are, but they have certain tracks too. But, they're gonna be,
but there's a huge difference between the conservative professor and Charlie Kirk.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of like the reason why all of these conservative Supreme Court justices are Catholics, because really Catholics are the only ones who you can get to read that much law on the conservative side.
There's actually, now, a lot of what you're saying does sound sort of offensive and straw manny, but there actually are theories like Robert Sapolsky was talking about how there are certain neurological tendencies in people that they find also tend to be on the far right, where there are issues with the way that the human brain deals with abstractions. And the people oftentimes they find are in on the far right have got this inability to manufacture the chemicals necessary for that.
Well,
and they're not sure where this is inherited or how. But this thing is a known phenomenon as of like 2005 or so.
I don't like putting it down to biological determinism because...
Well, it's not. A lot of this isn't. That's the thing about a lot of Sapolsky stuff is that we don't know how much of it's biological and we don't know what creates the habitat that allows for the reproduction of it.
Fair. People do tend to use him that way, but yes, you're right.
Family groups operate in that way. But however it comes about.
Yeah, but my basic thinking when I say something like that, which does sound very strawmanny, and I mainly say as a joke in a strawmanny context, is that I would argue that, yeah, personality-wise, the people who are conservatives are generally going to be more brash and open, you know, especially white men, because societally they're raised that that's their right. That's what we're allowed to do. People have to entertain us because free speech, and the fact that I deserve I deserve to be listened to, even if maybe black people don't, according to society. And so the people who are on the conservative side with that mindset aren't necessarily going to like to be in a place like academia where they are not listened to and where they're judged more on what they're saying and how they're saying it rather than the fact they're saying it. And I find a lot of conservatives really like more being applauded for the fact that they're saying their views rather than what their views are.
Or having an enemy in lieu of having a view themselves.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I would just, there are lots of conservative professors here, but you know, we're in Idaho, but they always like pride themselves on being different from the general, you know what I mean, like the Rush Limbaugh conservative or
there
whatever.
There was no chud who was a professor, is one thing I'd say about that.
Well, I mean, it's funny because that brings to mind Professor Blaine. Professor Blaine is the senior-most member of the staff in the sociology department. And he's seen as a somewhat conservative figure compared to the rest of the staff in sociology. But the thing is, like, he was in Berkeley in the 60s during some of the, some of the most infamous experiments. He is completely against a lot of the ideas that people equate with the right now, and considers himself to be a political liberal. And it's sort of funny looking at him and him being sort of like, an almost centrist figure. And this is the person that Jordan Peterson is caricaturizing as the hippies of the 60s have become the professors of today. He's nothing like that at all. Well, he's the most conservative person in the damned department.
The hilarious thing is that actually Peterson says that sometimes, but there's also an interview he did with Paglia, who's another writer, and he doesn't contradict her on this at all. So that's where I say it's perfectly fine for me to say you agree with this because you said she was right in the interview.
Right. It's like he's nodding during this interview the whole time.
And she says the hippies of the 60s, the Marxists of the 60s, all burned their brains out on acid.
The real ones.
And so they're not in academia. In fact, it's all the people who were too much of losers to be out partying in the 60s, like Foucault and the rest of them. By the way, saying Foucault didn't party is bullshit.
Yeah, that's true.
Who in the 70s, because they aren't, their brain isn't rattled from LSD, like, that's how LSD works or whatever. But so there's just this idea that
Yeah, it's ironic too because Peterson's pro psychedelics, and that's one of those things it's really a leftist cause, and conservatives are more about the war on drugs, and but just to go back to the Camille Paglia conversation, like that's really two peas in a pod right there. They're just splashing around, and so Hansi Freinacht wrote a kind of critique of Peterson based on that discussion. And so that was their metamodern take on Peterson. And it's pretty unforgiving. I think it was called A Marathon of Academic Incompetence. And, just to put it in context, like, again, like from a metamodern perspective, you can appreciate things Peterson is right about. I don't want to get into things he's right about. It's problematic, but just psychedelics is one, for example. So it's possible to critique him from a good place, and I think that's what we're trying to do at this conference.
This is my Paglia like meme that I made. Like,
yeah, I saw that today. It's genius.
Yeah, so I mean, and it requires some explaining. Some people who saw it were just like, "This is opaque. I have no idea what you're trying to say here." So it's like, okay, so obviously it's like the classic Drake meme, but with Peterson's face. Whoever found that was a genius. This is the best new template ever.
Is a pedophile.
Yeah, well,
he must be using yay memes from now on.
We've all moved into new iterations of this, but okay. So the point is that Natalie Wynn from ContraPoints presents one of these roast modern classics.
I'm stealing that.
And his response, was no comment. And that was his only tweet to the whole thing. And it was like, she actually has a lot of really compelling stuff there beyond. And it's not all her in the bathtub with his cutout. There's a lot of other stuff going on there too that he's not commenting on, stuff that's damning for him. But then when it comes to Paglia, which with her whole turfy, fashy, she's talking about degeneracy taking over and how trans people always come out when degeneracy takes over civilization. And he's just like, oh yeah, I've got to give this person time to talk. And there's a lot going on here, right? And it's just like, and so the whole rule number 9 applied. Well, the 9th rule and 12 rules to life is that you should always assume the other has something to say that you can learn from. Point being, no, not Natalie.
Yeah.
Not the new queen.
Hypocrisy.
Yeah. But I mean, if it's a good meme, you don't have to explain it. I don't know. But there you go.
It's great.
Cool. So anyone want to get a final word in here before we close this thing out? Besides the fact that I want to fall down this forever. Wait, where did we go? Oh.
I guess I gotta go find some lobster and cook that son of a bitch because
revenge. My lobster thermidor is fantastic. I'm looking forward to it more and more every day now.
Thank you, Brent. This was a fantastic treat. Lampe, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, awesome.
Good luck with the rest of the conference. I look forward to watching it.
Yeah, and I look forward to other people watching this. I think Adam was watching this from the YouTube, so he just wasn't able to get into the room, but everyone else will hopefully watch this soon. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah, and I appreciate more interaction and feedback on my other work if any of you guys are interested, because I think abstraction was a big part of my presentation and my project in general. And yeah, let me just end by kind of reiterating that point, because it is in a way for Peterson, it's central to his worldview and to his methodology. But because I feel I've actually dug into it more, including Peterson's work, there's a lot more to say about abstraction. I think it's an aspect of metamodernism too, in the way that we can kind of level up. And Benjamin Bratton is a perfect example of that. And I know that Bratton's not a fan of Peterson either, and I won't speak for him, but the book, The Stack, is amazing, and it just takes the public discourse in a completely opposite direction from Peterson. So I think that's where the left should be headed.
Well, I've read the first third of the Listening Society, and honestly, the first third is him just setting up for how great this is, and then never. So I haven't gotten to like the substance yet. But just going off the first third, I think that this is, along with something like Peter Rollins, a really great replacement or like level up from Peterson if you just came into humanities, politics, and psychology for the first time through Peterson as a non-academic. I think like Henze or Rollins is probably like the next step out of that. And so I'm glad that you brought that in. It seems super relevant. So thanks, guys.
Awesome. Thanks.
Take care.